Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 273 of Humanity Rising. Today, we want to contemplate what it takes to be a good ancestor. And I want to open up our program by telling you a story. The story starts on June 19th, 1865, when Union troops marched into the state of Texas at the end of the Civil War, about 6 months after General Lee had signed his surrender at Appomattox in April. And by June, the Union Army was mopping up, and they came into Galveston, Texas. And the general announced there on June 19th, 1865, the final emancipation of the last slaves in the United States in Texas that were to be freed. And about 250,000 slaves in Texas were liberated. And that day, June 19th, became immortalized, and it quickly was morphed into a Juneteenth. And every year, the Black people in particular would commemorate their emancipation. Fast forward to the month of June in 1939. A Black family, a man by the name of Flake, living in Fort Worth, decided to move from the Black neighborhood into another predominantly white neighborhood. He was prosperous. He could afford the house, and he bought a house in June of 1939 and moved in with his wife and 3 kids. A couple weeks later, on June 19th, a crowd of 500 angry white people in that neighborhood created a mob and stormed his house and forced him with clubs, with his wife and 3 little kids, to flee. And then they burnt the house down. One of the children was a young girl, 12 years old, named Opal. And she was just young enough, but she was also old enough to understand what happened. And they found another house, and they were traumatized, and life continued. And but she never forgot that day and what happened. Fast forward again till 2015. And Opal Lee, she was married by then, Opal Lee, aged 89, wrote a letter to President Obama in his last year of office and said, "Mr. President, you need to start the process of transforming June 19th, Juneteenth Day, into a national holiday. And I'm going to demonstrate to you my passion around this, because I'm going to walk from Fort Worth, Texas, 1,400 miles, to Washington, D.C., age 89, and walk she did. To make a long story again very short, a few days ago, the US Congress, first the House and then the Senate by unanimous consent voted to institute a new national holiday in the United States commemorating Juneteenth, the emancipation of the slaves. Yesterday, President Biden signed that legislation into law. And standing right beside him, 94 years old, was Opal Lee, known now as the grandmother of Juneteenth. That is a good ancestor. That's a life whose passion, whose commitment, whose integrity will reverberate down through time. And 7, 10, 100 generations from now, they will look back on Opal Lee as a good ancestor. So that's what we're going to contemplate today. What does it take to be a good ancestor? But before we jump into the program, let us just take a moment, as we always do. Center yourself in your body. Take a few deep breaths. And attune yourself to your heartbeat. For the next minute and a half, listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of deep thanksgiving and gratitude that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to welcome Roman Krznaric, a public philosopher and intellectual born in Australia, but educated in his higher degrees at Oxford and London and Essex, where he took his PhD. He has been part of the public debate for many, many years. His most recent book is The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short term world, but he's also written extensively on empathy, which is the name of one of his books. Another one of his books was Wonderbox. Another one was Carpe Diem Regained. And currently he lives in the UK. But in his latest work, which I found very striking, he's asking all of us a question that we need to answer at this moment, when because of our dereliction of duty to the future, we've brought human life, planetary life, to the brink of a precipice. And scientists are telling us we have less than 10 years to turn it around. So maybe for the first time in human history, we have to consciously, collectively contemplate, what does it mean to be a good ancestor? What do we have to do such that our children, 7 generations hence, will look back on our generation like children in the future will look back on Opal Lee and say, that was a good ancestor. So Roman, welcome to Humanity Rising. And why don't we just start by you sharing with us your story and how you, your intellectual journey and how you came to write your latest book on being a good ancestor.
Absolutely, Jim. And thanks for that lovely introduction, both to my work, but also that incredibly powerful and beautiful introduction to Opal Lee and Juneteenth. And I think it really tells us something about, if we want to think about the future, we have to think about the past, you know, and the present tense, of course, and how all of those things are related. But for my own journey, towards writing a book called The Good Ancestor, why would one write a book called that? I have to go back many years in some ways to my own interest in the topic of empathy, particularly what psychologists call cognitive empathy or perspective-taking empathy. That's the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person, a great human ability that we all have, and a challenging one too, to put yourself in the shoes of people who've gone through traumas or from a very different social background from you. And many years ago, I started researching this and writing about it. And in the book I wrote about empathy, called Empathy, not very surprisingly, that book was mostly about how do we step into the shoes of people in today's world, people on the social margins or who are voiceless, whether indigenous people in Guatemala, where I used to do a lot of research back in the 1990s, working with indigenous Mayan people, or people sleeping on the streets of the cities we live in. And so it was about empathy across space. But something that was kind of nagging me at the back of my mind was, well, how do we step into the shoes of people through time, future generations, the billions upon billions of people who might be around in the year 2100 or 2300? How do we do that? And if I'm honest with myself, I think I was too afraid to tackle that question in that book on empathy because it was so difficult. It seemed so difficult. And then later, after writing that book, I founded a museum called the Empathy Museum, which travels around the world trying to give the experience of what it's like to be another person to people. And one of the exhibits we have, which was not invented by me, but by our brilliant director called Claire Patey, one of these exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes. And it's a gigantic shoebox, like a shipping container. It actually looks like a shoebox. It's beautiful and amazing. And it's the world's first empathy shoe shop. You walk inside and someone will fit you with a pair of shoes belonging to a stranger. It could be a Syrian refugee or Brazilian sex worker or an unemployed factory worker, whoever. And you can literally wear their actual shoes, walk in their shoes a mile while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their own life in their own words. And it's very simple. It's very powerful. It's kind of theatrical. It's embodied. And when I look at that exhibit, which has been all around the world, it's been in the US and Siberia and Brazil and Australia, all over the place. One of the challenges it raises is that same one that I was always struggling with, which is how do we create an exhibit, let's say, to step into the shoes of future generations, to connect 7 generations ahead or more. And that was really the task I set myself with writing this book, The Good Ancestor. And that title was, I kind of appropriated it a little bit from the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 50s. But in the 70s, he asked this question. He said, the great question for our time is, are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And clearly, I think he was drawing on indigenous culture and wisdom to kind of put that question into words. So that's, in a sense, how I got to where I am now, which is having tried to tackle something very difficult, which is how we connect with people who we cannot look in the eye, whose shoes we cannot slip into, who we cannot speak to face.
And what have you discovered when you've done that? I mean, what are the virtues, or what are the transformations of consciousness that occur when you go through that process?
Yeah, I think there are different ways of approaching it. You know, some people, I think, when considering their relationship with the future, go about it and can go about it in quite a rational way, which for some people I think is powerful, but not for all. So for example, I might say, okay, look, there's 7.7 billion people alive today. But over the past 50,000 years, an estimated nearly 100 billion people have been born and died. But over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. And in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your children and grandchildren, their grandchildren, all the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. Now, for some people, that idea, which is really something that comes out of utilitarian philosophy, kind of the weighing up of the scales, there's so many more people in the future. Who are we to impose our lives and interests on them without taking them into account? For some people, that kind of framing of it really hits them, right? Just knowing how many billions of people there are to come. But I think for others, and this is one of the things I was sort of learning as I was writing this book, for others, they can get to that point of extending their moral universe forward in time to future generations, the future planet, through, I think, something more emotional, you know, through some sense, for example, of the golden rule, you know, which is in almost every major religious and spiritual mode of thought, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, but trying to extend it through time. So let's do unto future generations how we would want past generations to have done unto us. And when you start thinking about that, I think in a way it connects back to the Opal Lee story in a sense, because if we think about what we have inherited from the past, well, clearly there are very positive things in some ways, the cities we still live in, or medical discoveries that many of us might benefit from, like the polio vaccine discovered by Jonas Salk. But also we are the inheritors of negative and destructive legacies too, legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism, creating deep inequities that must now be repaired, or legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that must now be transformed. And that inheritance raises the question, okay, well, what are we going to pass on to the generations to come? Which bits do we want to pass on, and which bits do we want to leave behind if you're thinking of that intergenerational kind of golden rule? But I think something I've really found is how thinking about that kind of intergenerational connection connects with different kinds of people, whether they are left or right or center or old or young. You know, whenever I give a briefing to politicians in the UK or elsewhere about, you know, why long-term public policy is important around climate change or bioweapons and all sorts of things, I tend to start with taking them on a bit of a kind of visualization exercise. Well, I'll ask them, you know, to close their eyes and then to imagine a young person in their life who they really care about, maybe a nephew or niece or child or grandchild, and then to imagine that person 30 years in the future and the joys and the sufferings they're facing. And then to take it further, to imagine them, for instance, on their 90th birthday party, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones, and to go and have a look out the window and see what kind of world it is out there. And then to imagine that that 90-year-old is about to give a birthday speech and suddenly looks over on the mantelpiece and sees a photograph of you, their departed ancestor, and decides instead to tell the room about the legacy that you left them, that something positive that you did to benefit their society. And I think in doing that kind of, I think quite sometimes emotionally charged sort of meditative activity, as it were, we start moving away from the self, let's say, because if I think of my daughter, who's 12, on her 90th birthday, it's almost the year 2100. That future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. But if I think about her in the future on her 90th birthday, what I realize, and certainly what I have realized, and this is one of the realizations I had through doing this research on this book, is that my daughter in that future is not all alone. She's not sort of floating in space. She is part of a web of the community she's part of, family and friends and loved ones, but also the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I have to care about all life. That's the only thing that kind of makes sense. So I think these are the different ways. I mean, there are many others ways we can try and make a bridge to the future. And I think different things work for different people. We need to kind of work with all of it, as it were. That's something that I've learned.
Yeah, and I think just dwelling on your young daughter for a moment, she's in some ways in a unique generation because it's this emerging Gen Z, I think, that is ground zero in the sense that, not all generations are equal. For thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, humanity just kind of floated along, hunter-gatherer societies, then the Neolithic Revolution, and then for the next 10,000 years, things kind of trundled along. And it's really been in the last 50, 75 years where scientists have been talking about the Great Acceleration, where all the graphs that have been going pretty stably for thousands of years basically are now going straight up. And so by the beginning of the 21st century, we're in a world now of such dynamic change and such dire danger that this next generation, and I think that the generation sort of from the boomers through Gen Z, so you have Gen Y, the millennials, Gen Z, there's a cluster of generations that are coming together. And upon the decisions that we collectively make, we're going to be remembered as one of those nexus moments in the human and planetary journey, whose decisions were critical in shaping the future trajectory. So I just wanted to put that in there, that some ancestors are more important than others, but I would say some ancestors, meaning us, are more consequential than others. And if you think, especially over the next 10 years, the decisions that we're going to be making, because we're going to either deal with climate change or it's going to spin completely out of control and we're going to lose our footing in the planetary ecology. So speak to us just for a moment about this moment in being an ancestor.
Sure. Well, I absolutely agree with you. In a way, I think that there's been no moment in human history where we have had such potential huge consequences of our actions for future generations. I mean, in a sense, one could date that to another June date, June 16th, 1945, when the first atomic test happened, the Trinity test, because that was the moment, in a sense, when humankind became capable of destroying the future for all life. But as you say, the great acceleration over the last, say, dating from the Second World War, with all those curves going up of CO2 and ocean acidification and deforestation, are signaling to us of what we have done and will be doing for centuries still to come to the planet, because of the carbon's going to stay there for decades and centuries. So there's that ecological long-term impacts. But I think there's also a whole set of technological threats that we have thrust upon the future as well. So things like artificial intelligence, bioweapons, genetic engineering. And then to that, I think we need to add into the mix other long-term issues. We need to be thinking long-term about the next pandemic that might be on the horizon, or we need to think long-term about deep wealth inequalities and racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation. These are all part of, I think, the set of issues, of which there are more too, where the common denominator is our obsession with the present tense, what I think of as the tyranny of the now. And one of the ways I sometimes think about this is that we have colonized the future. We treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century. They drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land. They treated the continent as if there was nobody there. Of course, there was the indigenous population. And now I think those struggles against terra nullius are still ongoing, land rights for indigenous people. But now we've also got a struggle against tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited territory that is ours for the taking. And of course, there are great inequalities in the way that the future is colonized. It is, vulnerable communities, poor communities, often people of color, who are going to be hit hardest by the impacts of the climate crisis, for example. There's a kind of climate apartheid, one might say, built into the way we treat the future, the way we dump on the future. So I think in all of this, I think we're often looking for the right kind of language, metaphors, analogies to talk about that thing, that future. There's a language of colonization, but the language of the good ancestor is another way of thinking about it. I sometimes talk about time rebels, people who are kind of committed to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. But these are all ways, I think, of changing the narrative in a sense about who we are, to help stretch our imaginations beyond the present tense, so that we are inhabiting the past and the future as much as the present. And none of this is easy, of course. There are cultures around the world where people are born into something a little bit more intergenerational. So in Aotearoa in New Zealand, for example, there's the concept of whakapapa, or whakapapa is the Maori word for genealogy or lineage, the idea that we are all in a great chain of life, going far into the past and long into the future. It so happens the light is shining right here, right now, and just to shine that light more broadly. So we feel the living, the dead, and the unborn all here in the room with us.
Oh, I love this notion of colonizing the future. And I think there's a connection between that notion and your subtitle around developing long-term thinking in a short-term world. I think you colonize the future when you don't think about it, that you're in a tyranny of the present moment, short-term quarterly profits, and the immediacy of your existence, almost by the nature of things, impels us to focus on self-gratification. Because when you start to think about the future, you start to think about long-term, you have to start thinking about a responsibility rather than an acquisition. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this vice grip that the world is in terms of short-term thinking, engendered by neoliberal economics, where there's all, the externalities, not only about the future, but the planet, are just terra nullius again. So speak to us about the contradiction in the world right now, and what you've learned about how you lead people into a more expansive, temporally elongated way of viewing the present that includes the future.
Well, it's certainly true that the the vice grip of short-termism is there and is built into our politics through short-term electoral cycles. It's built into digital culture. The politicians who can't see beyond the next, not just the next election, but the next tweet or the latest headline in 24/7 news. Businesses that can't see beyond the quarterly report, the markets that are spiking and crashing in speculative bubbles, which, as you say, come out of very much embedded in the neoliberal myopia, the eternal present of neoliberalism, which isn't thinking about resource exploitation, long-termism at all. But I think these struggles, there's a sort of a tug of war in society, which I write about in my book, between the drivers of short-termism and long-termism. But there's also a struggle going on in our own minds between what I think of as, I call it the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. And the marshmallow brain is the part of our neuroanatomy, which is focused on instant rewards and immediate gratification. That's the bit of our brains which gets us, getting the dopamine rush of pushing the buy now button, named after, of course, the famous marshmallow test, the psychology test from the 1960s, where kids had the marshmallow put in front of them, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. But famously, the kids couldn't resist and snatched the snack. Now, there've been many critiques of the marshmallow test, partly the way that it's impacted by socioeconomic context. So kids from poorer backgrounds find it harder to resist, partly because they also distrust authority, and there's really good reasons for it. But I think another critique of the marshmallow test, the one that I make in my book particularly, is that there's a whole nother part of a neuroanatomy, which is this, the acorn brain. It lives here in the frontal lobe above our eyes, the front of our heads, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain which is newer than the old marshmallow brain. It's only a couple of million years old, the acorn brain, which is new. Our marshmallow brain is about 80 million years old. We share it with rats and other mammals. But the acorn brain is the bit which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And humans are really good at this, actually. So other animals will plan a bit for the future. So a chimpanzee will, get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what a human being will do, right? That acorn brain is what allows us to save for our pensions or write song lists for our own funerals. That's the acorn brain in action. It's what enabled us to build the Great Wall of China or voyage into space, or allows climate scientists to do models going 200 years ahead of sea level rises, right? So we have this immense capacity to be acorn growers rather than marshmallow snatchers. But of course, as your question really brings out, it's the way we organize our societies favors the marshmallow over the acorn. Our economic systems are, all about GDP growth, that curve going up, or our education systems too are not getting us to connect with that long term. And I noticed in the chat that Jane mentioned a great education program in Canada called Roots of Empathy, which I've actually visited in Toronto. And if I can just say something very briefly about it, because it is quite wonderful. Over 1 million kids around the world have done Roots of Empathy. What they do is they bring a live baby into the classroom, kids aged between about 5 and 12, to teach the kids empathy skills. And what happens, the baby comes into the classroom, not alone, also with a parent and an instructor from the program or a carer. And the kids sit around the baby and they start talking about the baby. Why is the baby crying? Why is the baby suddenly looking up at the mother or father? And they're trying to step into the baby's shoes, this idea of cognitive empathy. But they use that as a jumping off point for then talking about, well, what's it like to be a kid bullied in the playground, or to be a family living on the streets of Calcutta? So they're trying to extend the empathy outwards. But then what they also do as part of the curriculum is try and get the kids looking at the baby to talk about the baby in the future. What responsibilities do we have to that child in the future? What actions are we doing now that's going to affect them? As Jane's just written in the chat now, the baby becomes the teacher. And in fact, when you go to a Roots of Empathy class, the baby has a little t-shirt saying the word teacher on it. And so these are the ways that I think we need to be fundamentally transforming key institutions to bring that longer now, that sense of intergenerational justice into the present moment.
Yes, the baby as teacher is a profound notion. Thank you, Jane. And Stanley Pokras is also making an interesting point in the chat. Roman, he's saying we've entered the age of helpfulness. Where human society can be more peaceful and prosperous as more people become engaged in paying attention to the needs of others. And I would add, as you're indicating, thinking about the needs of others, not only now, but the needs of others under the seventh generation. And that brings us to this whole domain of empathy. In some ways, what is most conspicuously lacking in the neoliberal economic model or politics, and one of the reasons why we've become so short-term in our thinking and we've colonized the future, as you described, is because our society is almost devoid of empathy. So you've written another book all about empathy, but I would love to hear you speak to us about the relationship between sort of the empathy quotient and the capacity to develop that acorn.
Yeah,
I think there's a connection.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a connection there. There have been very famous studies over the last 10 years or so talking about the growing empathy deficit in society, particularly amongst, a lot of the studies are of US college students, but it goes beyond that. And there are a lot of debates about why it's happening. Partly it's to do with hyper individualistic consumer culture, it has to do with urbanization and digital culture and many different factors. And I certainly think neoliberalism is an important part of that mix. And clearly that capacity to see the world from the perspective of the other, which is what the kind of, there's two different kinds of empathy, basically. If you open a psychology textbook, one's what's called affective empathy. And that's empathy is a shared or mirrored emotional response. So you see anguish on a child's face and you too feel anguish. That's what's called affective empathy. But if you see the anguish on that child's face and you feel a different emotion, like, oh, the poor little thing, you feel sorry for them, that's what psychologists typically call sympathy. That's an emotional response, but one that isn't shared. But the one that I think that has the really big social impact, though closely related to the first kind, is what is called cognitive empathy, where we try to imagine the position of somebody else whose life might be very different from our own, like someone sleeping on the street that we walk past every day. And of course, we all know how we can fail so easily to see their perspective. There's a guy who I used to walk past every day who lived on the streets around the corner from where I live in Oxford, England, not Oxford, Mississippi. And he was always muttering crazily to himself, picking up cigarette butts, nose, shoes in the snow. And I thought, I've got not much to do with this guy. We have little in common. One day I stopped to talk to him. Well, it turned out we both studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University. And we developed a friendship based on our mutual interest in Nietzsche, Aristotle, and pepperoni pizza at the time when I still ate pepperoni, not anymore. So, we can have these encounters which make us recognize the need to see other people's perspectives. But the more challenging thing, thinking if we're in an age of helpfulness, well, who is the constituency that is part of our realm of help? Or if you think about it in terms of the idea of the common good or the demos in democracy, who are the citizens? Well, we think of them as people in today's world typically. And what we need to do is try and bring future generations, but in some ways past generations too, into the realm of where we have relation, to draw on the language of Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, coming into relation with people. And I was having a conversation the other day with this Eritrean community activist who lives in Belgium, and she was saying that whenever her grandmother used to say to her, apparently, whenever you're feeling down in life, just imagine yourself in that great chain of ancestors going long into the past, far into the future, and just for a moment, just pause, take a breath, and just turn to the left and look in the eye of someone from the generation behind and just thank them for what they gave you. And then just turn to the right and look in the eye of the person in the next generation and tell them you might do for them. And it's a kind of grounding and experience. And I remember when she said that, the hairs were kind of standing on my end, on the ends of my skin, because I think it was helping us in a way overcome the fact that it's exactly sort of our hyper individualistic culture which has severed us, cut us from these generations. So we need to find ways of, in a way, recovering that, and in a sense that is an empathic challenge through time, as well as the one we know that exists across space. And I think if we make that imaginative journey, we're starting to switch on our acorn brains. Human beings we're experts at the temporal pirouette. You know, our minds can dance across time horizons. Let us use this incredible capacity to start thinking and connecting with those the people and planet who will be here long after we are dead.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, you know, this gives rise in my mind, Roman, another connection that I think is worth exploring, because I think there's a relationship between the immediacy of our time frame and the lack of empathy, the empathy deficit, and nature deficit disorder. Increasingly, human beings are disconnected from each other while simultaneously we're disconnected from nature. So speak to us for a moment about the relationship that you see between nature deficit disorder and empathy deficit disorder, because I think they're connected.
That's a beautifully put question, Jim. I say the way that I think about this is, or someone whose thoughts I've found very helpful in thinking about this, is the great biomimicry thinker, Janine Benyus. And if anyone hasn't read her book, Biomimicry, or seen her TED Talk, I really advise it. And she's a beautiful writer, very poetic. And, you know, all her work is about asking about what can we learn from nature's 3.8 billion years of research and development. And one of the questions she raises is this. She says, well, how is it that other species have survived and thrived for 10,000 generations or more, whether they're birds or beavers or bats, when they're not going to be around in 10,000 generations, you know, to care for their offspring? She says, well, what other creatures have learned to do through evolution is they've learned to take care of the place that will take care of their offspring. As she puts it, life has to create conditions conducive to life. In other words, you don't foul the nest. You live within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which you are embedded, which of course is the opposite of what human beings have been doing at an ever-increasing pace and scale over the last century, that great acceleration that you mentioned. And so that really, in a way, raises a kind of a secret to long-term thinking, which is it's not all about time. It's just as much about place. It's about restoring and repairing and caring for this place that will take care of our offspring. So it's about falling in love with ice sheets and savannas and mountains and meadows. And there's a beautiful Mohawk blessing, which I understand is spoken when a child is born. Thank you, Earth. You know the way. And I think in that, in a sense, is an answer to the question, which is that if we want to empathically connect with those future generations, we need to overcome our nature deficit disorder. You know, we need to fall in love with the living world that will take care of our offspring. So there's a kind of a confluence there, which is as much about place as it is about time.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. I think that's a very profound point, Roman. Thank you for that. And what that raises in my mind is the question of education, the question of how do we instill empathy, connectivity with nature in how we learn and how we reflect upon the world. And have you given much thought about how you inculcate these kinds of qualities into people that don't know that eggs come from chickens, or you know, and don't have the kind of empathy that is really called for.
It's a really challenging thing, of course, to change people's fundamental views of the world and their connection with it. Clearly, what our education systems look like is part of what changes us and next generations. And in that sense, one can draw on some of the really exciting work being done by these time rebel movements, as I think of them, who are dedicated to the longer term. So just for example, the David Suzuki Foundation in Canada has curriculum materials they've developed for high schools, where they get the young people to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the famous UN document after the Second World War, and point out that there's nothing about future generations in it. And they get the kids to write new articles for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights all about future generations. And what a beautifully simple but powerful thing to do. So I think there's a sort of a realm of education there, but I think there's also something to be said for the power of social movements who are changing the conversation about our relationship with the future. So for example, in the US, there's a great public interest law firm called Our Children's Trust based in Eugene, Oregon, who have launched a landmark legal case against the US federal government, also against state governments, on behalf of 21 young people who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. And so they're basically trying to get the US government to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. But in the history of rights, this is a really incredible thing, probably one of the most incredible shifts in the way we think about rights since the French Revolution, the idea of giving rights to people who may not be born for decades. Now, their legal struggle is a bit of a David versus Goliath one, but it has they may or may not succeed, but they're ongoing in their work, and they will not give up, because this is a long game, particularly when it comes to legal struggles, as we've seen in the history of the civil rights movement in the US too. But Our Children's Trust is influencing legal cases around the world. So recently in Germany, the Constitutional Court ruled that the government was violating the rights of future generations because of its limited carbon emission targets, which is basically dumping problems on future generations. Similar cases have been passed in the Netherlands. There are ongoing cases in Uganda and in Colombia, as well as legal movements to give rights to the living planet, like the Whanganui River in Aotearoa in New Zealand has been given the same rights as a person, in the same way that corporations were given rights in the US in the late 19th century. So I think there's all this sort of legal. I never thought law would be so kind of sexy and interesting and inspiring. I mean, I'm a political scientist by background long ago, but I've now seen the power of law as one of the many things that we need to do to, I think, not just create policy change, but to change what I think of as the ethnosphere. It's actually a concept I've stolen from Wade Davis, the anthropologist. And the ethnosphere is the kind of the swirl of ideas and attitudes and beliefs that we breathe, like we breathe the biosphere, the air of the biosphere, but we breathe in the ideas of the ethnosphere, and we need to change what's in the ethnosphere. So one might say that with the rise of neoliberalism, individualist values started becoming more prominent than collectivist values because of neoliberalism. And I think what we need to be doing partly is thinking about how do we get the ideas, well, this is sort of my mission, as it were, ideas about intergenerational care and justice as part of the atmosphere, so it becomes normal to have conversations like we are having right now.
Beautiful, brilliantly put. Thank you so much. Let me change the conversation here to get your take on the following, which I think is a larger gestalt for what's happening in human history. And I think, Roman, there are two things that are happening unique to our generation that I would love to have your comment on. The first is the reality that we've now gone exponential in terms of the acquisition of human knowledge. And the best way to understand that is that if you take a chessboard of 64 squares, everyone, and you start with 1 grain of rice on the lower left square, and you double it 64 times till you get up to the upper right. By the time you get to the upper right, you've almost got an infinite number of rice kernels. Now that's important because human knowledge was working itself up the chessboard, according to scientists, till 2007. And at 2007, which, as it turned out, was the year of the iPhone, when Steve Jobs came out with that first iPhone, and it was the year that Facebook was launched. We're now doubling our knowledge every 12.5 minutes. So we humans, when we're thinking about the marshmallow and the acorn, need to take in that we're doing this not in ordinary times. We're doing this in exponential times. That's one side of this coin, Roman, I'd love to have you speak on. The other side of this coin is a point that's been made by Yuval Harari, the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He asserts, as a public intellectual like yourself, that the most important event in all of human history is taking place in our generation, and it is this. This is the first generation where we have extended intelligence away from biology into machines. Up until our generation, intelligence was always encapsulated into a biology. It was a person, it was a monkey, it was a dolphin, it was a bird. But what we have done with our knowledge now is projected intelligence into machines. And what we're seeing with artificial intelligence is that these machines are rapidly outstripping the human capacity to absorb, manipulate, and utilize information. So I just want to take this conversation out to that rung of the exponential growth of knowledge and the age of the machine. And one thinks of the Matrix. But what's your take on all that?
Sure. So on the question of exponential knowledge, I would challenge that idea that knowledge has become exponential, just because I've recently read a book which is about to come out, and I've just got the proof copy of it right here with me. It's called Human Frontiers, by a great thinker called Michael Bhaskar. And in that book, he argues that, in fact, the high point of human knowledge really was 1873. Since then, and he's very precise about it. Since then, actually, it's become harder and harder to have big ideas. It takes more research, more science, more money, more everything. And they look at, this is a classic sort of field where you look at the number of patents per amount of money you put into the research, and that number has been diminishing. So it's become harder and harder to have sort of breakthrough ideas. So there's much more information in the world exponentially. But in terms of the knowledge that matters, if you're looking at that scientific knowledge, one might sort of say, actually, there's a slowdown rather than an exponential speeding up. But of course, all these things come down to how you measure it all and all that kind of thing. I think what I would say about knowledge is, in fact, to really answer that question, I need to just put on a coat. Hold on one moment. I'm going to just put this on and all will become clear. Right, Now, you might be wondering why I'm wearing this rather fetching orange and white kimono-like cloak, and I will explain. So, in Japan, there is an amazing movement called future design. And it is a movement which is all about local government decision-making and participatory democracy. And it is directly inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making, found in Lakota communities and many other communities. And the way future design works is that they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically split them into two groups. So half of them are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these kind of ceremonial robes to wear. And this is a real one from the small town of Yahaba, population 30,000. And the people in the robes are told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out that the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns or the cities where they live, whether it's long-term investment in healthcare or action on climate change or artificial intelligence or all sorts of things. And that movement is now spreading from small cities like Yahaba to big cities like Kyoto. It's being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance, big companies like Fujitsu. But of course, the point I really wanted to make here is about the way we use indigenous knowledge and the kind of knowledge that counts. How do we sort of pass it or divide it? Which bits do we look for? And I think when we're talking about, particularly around the ecological threats that we're facing, clearly there's a lot of knowledge around indigenous wisdom that we need to be drawing on, particularly when we're thinking about, relationship with the living world and long-termism. So that's what I broadly say about that question of exponential knowledge. Let's say, the real question here, I think in a way is, I need to think about it more. It's a really interesting question, it's about how we choose to use the knowledge that we have, isn't it? It's what do we draw upon? And these are sort of existential choices of where we go. Do we go to the economics textbook, which has a demand and supply diagram on a white background with no biosphere around it? Or do we go somewhere else? Do we go to donor economics, as someone mentioned there in the chat, which I've written about my book? So on the second question, Yuval Harari, about the shift from biology to machines being the most important shift. I mean, certainly I think that is what he thinks, and that's certainly clear in his book, Homo Deus, and in the book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. I guess the question, I feel a little bit conflicted about Harari in some ways. Let me just say one thing about this. I'll probably end up saying more. One of them is, I think one can think about a lot of these technological shifts which are happening. We don't know whether 2049 is going to be like the film Blade Runner 2049 and the machines have taken over. In that realm around AI, for example, there's a lot of uncertainties. And I think we can get very preoccupied with that. And what happens is we leave behind the ecological risks because the technological stuff is sort of sexier to look at. But actually, in the realm of ecology, there's less uncertainty in many ways. As you keep saying, as you said, we are facing a planetary ecological crisis. We know, the future isn't uncertain. It's very clear what's going to be happening if we go with business as usual. By 2100, we'll have 3 to 4 degrees of heating and 1 to 2 meters of sea level rises, or probably more. We don't know exactly how much, and I feel some of these issues are left out of Harari's writings. For all sorts of reasons, partly to do with where he comes from historically and where he lives in the world and the kind of person he is. But I do like what he says about AI and why we need to worry about it. I think, in a way, the conundrums come out clearest for me, not in his writings, but actually in the work of the MIT physicist Max Tegmark, who has written a book called Life 3.0. And he's quite upbeat about AI, more upbeat than I am, and about us, merging with machines. But what he does is raises what I think is probably one of the fundamental questions, at least from my perspective, which is, how do we align the values of machines to human values? You might have a driverless car or a big machine which is controlling how healthcare is distributed in the society. That's the future we might be moving towards. But how are you going to decide how to do that? What does equality or fairness look like? Philosophers have been debating for 3,000 years, at least in the Western tradition, about what fairness and equality really is. Well, how do then you program a machine to fairly distribute resources for healthcare? Do you give it to wealthy people so they can grow a bit older and live longer, or do you give it to people who are lower down the socioeconomic ladder? And I can't see that, we can find easy answers to any of this, because these are moral dilemmas, and I think that's part of the fundamental problem of the shift from biology to machine, that we've still left with the human questions about values. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, I think, Harari is making a very profound point. And because we're caught up in our empathy deficit disorder and nature deficit disorder and short-term thinking, we're not calibrating the implications of this revolution in the way that is required to ensure that this transition from biology to machine intelligence is done correctly. And so I think I would share that concern. And one could bring in bioengineering and genetic technology and CRISPR, which about, where they can now slice and dice your DNA and your genes in ways that can create almost anything you can imagine. And so the question that you're raising, I think, is the seminal question. How do we apply ethical norms? And I would say the precautionary principle to this runaway freight train of scientific data? And as I think, has been observed, there's a difference between data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And this exponential explosion is at the level of data. And that other guy was right, but there hasn't been much creative thinking since 1873. And that distinction is the problem. Because, if you've changed everything in the world except your consciousness, you're heading right into a disaster. But these are major issues that that humans in our generation are having to grapple with for the first time in human history, because never before did anybody have to think about intelligence in machines. That's actually within the last 30, 40 years. But there's been barely even any public debate. That's the concern to me, is the lack of public debate. So how do you begin, Roman, to kind of think this kind of conundrum through? Because I think all of us are aware of it, but I think most of us are unsure how to even think about it.
Well, I'm always in dilemmas about how to think about these things. Let me just take off my Japanese coat. I think, to give a broad answer to that, my instinctive reaction to when I'm looking at all that future rushing towards us, the machines, the CRISPR, the geoengineering, my instinctive reaction is to look to the past, to look to history. I mean, I once wrote a book called The Wonder Box. In the US, it's called How Should We Live? And it's about the lessons we can learn about everyday life from looking in the past. So what can the ancient Greeks teach us about love? Or what can we learn from the Renaissance about rethinking our attitude to death? But equally, I think these big technological questions, these big questions of changes of our time, we can learn from the historical there. And one of the issues I've been thinking about recently, and my thoughts are not fully formed on this at all, but I was thinking about artificial intelligence. Let's take that topic. Is there anything in history that we can learn from to help us think through something like AI? Now, your immediate thought would be like, no way. I mean, we haven't created machines that can think in the past. So what could we possibly learn from? Well, if you stop to think about it, one place my mind went was to think about the invention of banking and financial capitalism in the Renaissance during the Medici period, 16th century, where we created something we couldn't control, It was called global capitalism, right? It took quite a long time to develop, and this is what we're facing with AI, the prospect of creating something we couldn't control, right? And we've tried to control this global capitalist octopus in various ways with more or less success in different places at different moments in history. But maybe there's something to learn there. Or equally, the other place my mind went to on that AI question was, have we ever created a technology like AI, had made that kind of cognitive leap? And the place, what I thought about was the invention of stone tools in the Neolithic period, where, all around the world, early humans invented something incredible, which was stone tools, which were not just bits of rock that you found and started bashing into other ones, but tools that you had to plan to make them. You had to imagine what the shape would be and then work backwards to realize the stages required to make what are called three-dimensional stone tools from 12,000 years ago. This is a complex cognitive leap. So our minds were changing, intelligence was changing. And at the same time, these tools absolutely transformed society. They made agriculture possible. They made new kinds of warfare possible, all sorts of stuff. So again, there's another, in terms of analogical thinking with the past, where this, I'm not saying I can make any great predictions about the future based on looking at Neolithic stone tool building or the invention of capitalism in the Renaissance, but that's where I go for my first port of call, let's say, in trying to think through things, looking for lessons from history.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The people, what is it they say? If you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it. And we seem to be repeating it over and over and over. By the way, Rob Wheeler is asking about waste dumps. He's making a very interesting point that when we think about future generations, we ought to think about waste dumps. Only 9% of the natural resources that we access and use are recycled or reused. The rest is just thrown away and either pollutes the natural environment or ends up in a waste dump. And that these waste dumps are created with no thought about what we will probably have to mine them so the resources can be used by future generations. But these waste dumps are such a total mess that it will probably be almost impossible to do it. And I think Rob is just bringing something in as a kind of a microcosm to a consciousness that if you think about almost any other domain, it's replicated with varying degrees of statistics. But the waste dump is just a useful metaphor for this contemplation of how we be a good ancestor.
Yeah, actually, it for some reason, when you're just telling me about what Rob's comment and question there, I had this gruesome picture came to my mind, which was painting by Goya called Saturn Eating His Son. It's really quite gruesome if anybody knows it. Saturn is literally eating one of his children. And, we are future eaters, in the way that we use resources and the waste we create and all these kinds of things. And one might go to Goya as a starting point there. I mean, certainly for me, and I find those statistics that Rob just said, they were, very powerful. And to me, I kind of tend to embed them in the whole field of ecological economics, which I've had to learn since studying economics 30 years ago, where I didn't learn anything about that. I just learned about that demand and supply diagram on the white background. But through reading the work of people like Herman Daly, starting to recognize that something that just seems so obvious, that the economy is a subset of the living world, that you can't create, if you really care about the long term in a deep sense, well, you can't have a world where you use resources faster than they can be naturally replenished, and that you create waste faster than can be naturally absorbed by oceans and other carbon sinks. You can't create a world that isn't based on the idea of a circular economy. I saw some people in the chat mentioning there about circular economy, which is clearly where we need to be going if you really start thinking about long-termism seriously, where we are, eating that future. And so I think there's a lot of really though, in my book, The Good Ancestor, I talk a lot about a lot of the political changes that would need to happen. Things like rights for future generations, or the fact that, say, in Wales, they have a future generations commissioner. We need to redesign politics and democracy itself for a longer term, but equally, we need to be reinventing what our economies look like. And I think thinking about waste, falling in love with waste, or trying to deal with it is one of those things to do.
Yes. Well, as we bring this to a close, Roman, I'd like to return to something that I said before, of this differentiation between data and information and knowledge and wisdom. And, as we stand, on the edge of this waste dump that we call our societies these days, and I'm thinking of Tacitus's great line about the Romans. They created a wasteland and called it peace. Speak to us about how you view the requisites for wisdom in our day. And along with wisdom, I think Kurt Kruger was bringing in a question. Would love to have you share with us your contemplation of how you would imagine peace, and what pathway there might be starting from where we are to attain that. But as you're contemplating the marshmallow and the acorn, how do you understand what wisdom is? What would you say about wisdom?
I love how big your questions are, Jim. So that question about the requisites of wisdom, or what it is, I think the way I go about thinking about that is, and I think the way I think about it comes out of my own history and my own journey, is I think of a distinction that I make between introspection and outrospection. I think if you want to learn about who you are and how to live, which is the great question of wisdom of the ancient Greeks, how to do that stuff. I think we've certainly done a lot of looking inside, I think, in the last century or so. Everyone from Freud to Oprah have been asking us to look inside ourselves for the questions of who we are, how to live, what purpose is. And I think there's a real value to that, clearly, that we need to self-reflect. But the other side of that, I think, is the need for what I call outrospection. That's about discovering who you are and how to live by stepping outside yourself, by discovering the lives of other people, other cultures, other moments of history, other ways of looking at the world. And of course, there are many ways to go on this outrospective journey. One way to do it would be to nurture your curiosity about strangers, to talk to people whose lives are different from yours, who've gone through the kinds of things that Opal Lee went through, for example, to go back to that, and to see that your experience, your way of looking at the world is not the only way of looking at the world. And that, to me, is one of the beginnings of wisdom, because it's about extending beyond the boundary of the ego, and to know that my perspective is not the only perspective, because that, to me, seems to be the cause of so much conflict in society. And that, I think, links to the second question about what is peace, and where does it come from, and what is it, how do we get there? Well, one way to think about that, let's say, is to think about war and how wars happen. Well, one explanation of that is through the creation of boundaries between cities in medieval Europe, or between nation states today. And we know that the boundaries between nations are human constructs. You always hear about these astronauts who, look down at the Earth and they can't see any of the borders anywhere, right? They just see one spaceship Earth floating in the great inky darkness. And I think that's what we need to realize today. And I happen to live in a country which is in a state of kind of hyper nationalism coming out of Brexit and things like that, trying to assert itself as its own empire dies by saying, I am different from a country, France or Germany or whatever. But of course, a country like Britain, like the United States, is made up of immigrants and, has its history of conquest and all sorts of things. So I think that when thinking about peace, we need to think about where the borders lie and how they get there. And that raises the larger question is, can we really think about the whole earth as one global village consciousness? Can our minds really extend that far? And I think this is a real challenge, because I've recently been reading some interesting work in evolutionary biology around this, people like Tulchin and David Sloan Wilson and others. And one of the sort of ideas that they often talking about is how the human capacity to cooperate, which is clearly what we need to deal with global shared challenges like the climate crisis, that human capacity to cooperate has emerged out of the way that humans needed to cooperate to fight against other people, in prehistory, right? That there's a book whose subtitle is, I'm trying to see it out of the corner of my eye, by Tulchin is his name, Tulchin, called Ultra Society. And I think the subtitle's like something like How Human Cooperation Emerged from 10,000 Years of Warfare. In other words, humans started to cooperate on a large scale in order to protect themselves against others and to fight others. Now, if that's true, and I'm not saying I agree with that thesis, but it's a big one to think about, how do we create a sense of a global civilization, a peaceful global civilization, when we don't have anyone to fight against, to meld us together? The aliens aren't coming. So how do we do that in a way that overcomes the strength of those national differences and religious differences and all those kinds of things? And I'm not sure we're capable of doing that. I actually think what we might need to be doing is creating multiple networks, like networks between cities, in the same way that, say, donut economics is emerging most powerfully, I think, between different cities who are creating networks, who are together working, transcending nationalist boundaries to create a different kind of world.
Beautifully put, beautifully put. It's making me think what you just said, Roman. It's made me think of Socrates in the Apology, one of the dialogues of Plato. You recall that he was considered by the Oracle of Delphi to be the wisest man in Athens. And when he was told that, he said, well, that must be because I'm the only one in Athens who knows that he knows nothing.
Right. And I think that's what outrospection is about. It's about telling you, recognizing that, yes, look inwards, but also recognize that there's this world out there. And maybe I'm not right about everything, maybe there's stuff I don't know, and the level of data and information and knowledge and wisdom, all of them, to live in a kind of ignorance, in a kind of healthy skepticism, let's put it that way, I think, which of course was part of the Socratic ideal, is one of those routes to take. Because I think ultimately one of the great powers we have as human beings is the power to change our minds. And we have inherited so much baggage from the past, the baggage of the Enlightenment, of the Steven Pinker-esque ever-increasing curves going upwards, and that technology and growth will solve all our problems for us. I just don't buy it. I don't think the evidence is there. And I don't think that's what can meld us together either.
Well, and I think too, what you're saying, and I think part of what's so exciting in the world right now is that we're in a world awash with data and information, and people are coming in the spirit of wisdom to realize that the way we've developed our interpretive frameworks in the past are now essentially null and void. And whether it's Kate Rayworth, coming up with the donut economic model, which basically turns traditional economics on its head, sideways and upside down, and then all of a sudden you've got the donut, and all of a sudden that outer thinking that you're talking about, that larger ecology, actually becomes the framework. So what you're talking about, in terms of the inner, that inner ring of the donut, how do we humans thrive? and then connecting it with the outer is, I think, the economics of the future. And you also mentioned David Sloan Wilson. I was just talking with him yesterday, and we're developing a whole program at Ubiquity. And he too is turning evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology on its head by saying exactly what you indicated, that at the heart of evolution is not the survival of the fittest. At the heart of evolution is the cooperation, is the survival of those who cooperate the best. And even our bodies are in a cooperation with us and the viruses and the various little bugs that are in our gut and so forth and so on. And every breath we take is coming from a tree. You know, so we're in an interlocking web of life, whether we know it or not. And in fact, it's the fact that we don't know that constitutes the major part of our predicament. So you've really shared a lot. So as we close, Roman, just take a couple minutes and, you know, if there's one takeaway for you, there's one immediate wise counsel that you would provide people about how to be a better ancestor. When all is said and done, what quality or qualities do you think we need to embody?
Well, perhaps people could do something a bit similar to something I did on my 50th birthday not too long ago, which is I went with my partner and kids for a bicycle ride. And about 10 minutes from my house is an ancient tree, a yew tree in a churchyard. And that tree is nearly 900 years old. And we climbed into the tree because you can climb into this yew tree. And we had a picnic up in the tree in the branches. And what did we talk about? We talked about deep time. The fact that humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story, that if the age of the earth is the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file on your middle finger erases human history. I think of that as deep time humility. And we spoke with the kids about how this tree had witnessed the bubonic plague in the 14th century and the Civil War in the 17th, and will witness things long after we are gone. And I think if there is one takeaway, I think is to try and get our own existence into something part of this, see it as part of this larger perspective. And I think when we start doing things like that, visiting an ancient tree, picking up a fossil, what can come out of that really is that question, going back to Jonas Salk in a way, which is, you know, how can we be good ancestors? In a sense, the existential habit to develop is to ask yourself that question when you get up in the morning, you know, what can I do to be a better ancestor today? Or at the end of the day, what have I done to be a good ancestor today? In whatever way you pursue it, find a way that feels true to you. And I think then you will be living true to this intergenerational spirit which runs through all humankind.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Roman. We started today, everyone, with Opal Lee on Juneteenth. And I think we've culminated with Roman Krznaric, who contemplates for us what a good ancestor needs to be. And if there's ever been a generation in the history of our kind that needs to answer the question of how to be a good ancestor, it's our generation now. So thank you, Roman, very deeply for your really sublime, you have a very well sculpted mind, my friend.
It's continually, it feels all scrambled, but if it looks sculpted for a few moments, I'm glad. And thank you, Jim, and thanks to everyone for your comments and questions and thoughts. Really stimulating. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're all welcome to the after chat, those of you who can join us. And the chat link has been put in to the chat box. And then next week, everyone, we're dedicating the whole week to a partnership that Humanity Rising has been forming with World Unity Week. And they're bringing together hundreds and hundreds of organizations all over the world to celebrate world unity as a consecration of the United Nations and the impulse to world peace that has emanated from that body over the last 75 years. And Humanity Rising is part of that. So we're going to be broadcast out through various nooks and crannies, and World Unity Week is coming into Humanity Rising. So we'll start next week with a contemplation of the importance of dialogue. That's inherent in everything that Roman said today. So how do we dialogue more deeply with ourselves and with each other around issues of global ancestral import? And then on Tuesday, we're going to have a conversation with Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of Senator Robert Kennedy and the nephew of President John Kennedy. And then the week will move on from there. So next week is going to be a big week for Humanity Rising. Roman, thank you. You've brought illumination. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you at the same time, same station on Monday here again for Humanity Rising. Bye for now. Thanks, my friend.